Thank you. So, John's emphasis at the beginning of his talk on looking up persuaded me. I've been debating about whether or not to ask you all to sing, but he persuaded me that we're going to do that very briefly, and this actually makes an important point. We're just going to sing a scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, okay? We're going to sing an ascending scale. We'll start there. Everybody together. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. Two observations. When we sing together, we make each other's bodies vibrate, which is interesting to think about. But more importantly, in every culture in the world, what we just sang is regarded as an ascending scale. It has a spatial metaphor, and I would argue it's an analogical reality that we've just participated in. We've participated in the reality of ascending, and that's just a tiny little example of how music communicates meaning that actually transcends just the sound of it. The talk today is going to try to make the case that that musical literacy is an importantly desirable goal, because I don't think musical literacy is regarded as conventionally as something that, of course, it's going to be on the list of desirable goals for every school and for every family. Typically, music instruction is reserved for a small minority of musical specialists rather than for everyone. But I think we're all created as musical beings, and we're more musical than is typically recognized. Of course, it's interesting that on this last day, my discussion of music was preceded earlier by a discussion of mathematics, because you probably all know music is one of the quadrivium, which includes arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. And yet music tends to get short shrift in most classical schools that I'm aware of. So I want to focus on the challenge of musical education. I'm not going to outline what it should look like or all of its effects, but why it's difficult to even imagine a serious musical education at our moment. And musical education as a way of connecting students to the reality of beauty. I need to point out, I don't have any formal training as a music teacher. I'm not even what would be recognized as a trained musician. I'm a rank amateur. As a young person, I had music lessons in piano, trombone, and classical guitar, and played recorder of various sizes also. And I've been involved with serious choral music most of my life. I worked at National Public Radio in the Arts and Performance Department between 1975 and 1983, which included work on a lot of classical music programs. And as was mentioned earlier, I've been writing a column for 11 years on sacred choral music and directing a choir. And our choir sings mostly, we sing 2 motets every Sunday, heavily skewed toward Renaissance polyphony. Renaissance polyphony, which combines the vertical and the horizontal in what I think of as a kind of Trinitarian expression of music. About 40 years ago, there was a best-selling book titled All I Really Need to Know I Learned in Kindergarten. In thinking about my own music education, it'd be fair to say the most important things I needed to know about music I learned in high school. I grew up not far from here in Prince George's County, and I attended public schools. My family moved to Greenbelt when I was in first grade, and I attended junior high there. And at the time, 7th and 8th graders, music was a required course for all 7th and 8th graders. And in those courses, every child had to learn how to read music and to make notation. We may have actually done some musical dictation where a melody was played and the kids had to write out the notation for it. But that's 7th and 8th grade, required for every student. In high school, I had two remarkable choral teachers. In 10th grade, I had a teacher who was very demanding conductor, choral conductor also, who made frequent references to one of his own teachers as if we knew who she was. Mademoiselle Boulanger, he referred to repeatedly. And some of you may know who Mademoiselle Boulanger is. Nadia Boulanger, one of the most important instructors in music in the 20th century. She had studied with Gabriel Fauré. She taught dozens of composers, conductors, performers, even the odd public school teacher. She actually, I don't know if it showed up in the Quincy Jones remembrances. He recently died. Quincy Jones studied with Nadia Boulanger. Someone once quipped that she was the most influential teacher since Socrates, which may be a bit exaggerated. But my musical imagination was certainly shaped by one of her students in a public high school. That's the thing I want to stress. This was not some elite private school. The second teacher who influenced me had studied for the priesthood, but decided to become a music teacher. And at the time he was teaching me, when I was in 11th and 12th grade, he was also cantor at the Basilica at the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception here, which meant that in classrooms in public schools, I was singing Palestrina, Victoria, Gabriele, Maurice Duruflé, and actually got to sing at some concerts and even an Easter Vigil service at the shrine because he needed a few more voices in his choir, so about 5 students would come in and sing occasionally. Again, a public school education. Now, I'm sharing this autobiographical information for 2 reasons. One is to give some sense of the power of teaching to shape the imagination of young people for their whole lives. That 10th grade teacher who'd studied with Mademoiselle Boulanger had learned how to conduct Bach from Mademoiselle Boulanger, and he had every year maintained a Bach choir in the school. You had to try out for it. I was 14 years old. I tried out for the Bach choir, got in. We spent almost the entire school year learning Jesu meine Freude, one of his motets. I can still sing the tenor part from that I learned in 1967, I guess that would have been. Everyone else was listening to the Sgt. Pepper album, I think, and I was learning Jesu meine Freude. But it changed my life. In fact, the choir I conduct has sung some of the movements from that motet. So that's one of the reasons. Teachers can have a profound influence in shaping the imagination that works through their whole lives. The other reason is to set in some historical perspective how much has changed in the state of music education in my own lifetime. I drive past the high school that I went to. Sometimes my parents live in a retirement home there, and it's in Beltsville. And I often wonder whether they're singing Jesu meine Freude this year. I don't think so. I had an intern, must have been 25 years ago now, and I asked her, did you sing any folk songs when you were in school? And she paused, she said, well, we sang some rap. And I said, not Go Tell Aunt Rhody. So music education, to the extent that it's even offered, has changed radically. So I want to outline some of the reasons why this has changed, why the cultural conditions that have affected those changes. First of all, following the logic of modernity, popular culture has displaced the musical tradition of the West, and the dynamics of what is commonly called youth culture, which I think is a contradiction in terms, since cultures historically are intergenerational. They're about the passing on of something from one generation to another. Youth culture is about the passing on of cultural artifacts from producers to young people who then give up their money. And the power of the music business and associated technologies has increased the hegemony of popular culture in the lives of many young people. Sadly, in the decades since I was in secondary school, teachers, parents, and clergy have adopted a "if you can't beat 'em, join 'em" strategy. And the effects of these shifts on the cultural lives of young people and not so young people has been profound. My sense is that much more energy has been expended by Christians, especially within the classical education movement, to redress the effects in other spheres of imaginative endeavors than has been the case with regard to music. The disordering of conventional musical practices has an interesting resonance or analogy with other everyday disorders. I've often thought about the disorders that are often identified that affect our engagement with language, food, and sexuality. It's obvious that Americans are confused about the meaning of sex. I claim that they're just as confused about the meaning of music, and for similar reasons. And the cultural forces that have misguided our engagements with the gifts of food and language have had similar effects on our engagement with music. Language, food, sex, and music are all gifts of God that orient us bodily when pursued thoughtfully and fittingly toward God himself, toward creation, toward our communities, and toward our own created identity. Just as jargon and propaganda corrupt our experience of language, just as convenience and commodification spoil our perception of the meaning of food, just as pornography, hooking up, and the exaltation of preference over natural order pervert the loving order given us in sexuality, so a very similar set of cultural forces has cut us off from the communicative power, the nourishment, and the beauty that's available in music. Not only are there intriguing likenesses among these four sets of disordered practices, I think that when one of them is disordered, the others can easily be affected. All four spheres deal with how we're oriented in creation and with one another. All four are involved with our understanding of and pursuit of our desires. All four are used in scriptures as metaphors for some aspect of our relation with God. And they're not just metaphors. By using the tongue lovingly in speech, by accepting food as a gift, by honoring the relationship between Christ and the church in marital fidelity, and by experiencing harmony both orally and analogically, our communion with God and with his people are enabled. Because music has such a powerful capacity to engage the whole person, its disordering is accompanied by a powerful defense mechanism that resists reform. Because music dwells in us richly and becomes fused to our identity, it's easy for us to become identified with our musical preferences. And I'm using very deliberately musical preferences in parallel with the idea of sexual preference. And I think the fact that music enters into us so deeply, it accounts for the absence of a robust discussion concerning musical practices and the possibility that, well, some of us may just have bad taste. I've been kind of on a crusade about this ever since, particularly I had a heart attack in 2011. My heart stopped 3 times. I should be dead. Well, actually, my motto now is I should be dead, I'm going to be candid. I was unconscious for 14 hours and missed the helicopter ride in the process, sadly. And as I was recovering, the doctors said, well, you need to look at sources of stress in your life and ask, how can you reduce them? And I realized that one of the great sources of stress was I was often invited to speak at Christian colleges or in churches or conferences on the disorders of modern culture, and then expected to participate in worship in which the music that was presented there was exhibit A of one of the disorders of modern culture. And it wasn't just that the music upset me. As I thought about this lying in bed for 2 weeks, it wasn't just that the music upset me. What upset me was the fact that I realized that I couldn't even have a good conversation with the people who'd done this about why what they had done might be unwise, at least unwise. And so that's why I think that the defense mechanism, there's no Wendell Berry for music. There's no one challenging, or Michael Pollan. There's no one who gets such a big audience in challenging the way our engagement with music has deteriorated, particularly in the 20th century, as there is for food or for language. And I think I have a friend who was trained as a jazz vibes player, and he and I have talked a lot about this, about what is it. And I think it's because there's something so intimate about our experience with music that it forms our identity very early on, and it's hard for us to imagine ourselves not living in that music, and that music not living in us, a kind of cohabitation. Disordered musical practices make us love things that we shouldn't, while depriving us of opportunities for delight in the best that music can be. The unique nature of music enables it to shape our affections and dispositions with an unparalleled power. So philosophers, theologians, and teachers long believed that the shaping of musical taste was an important part of moral formation. And for a host of reasons, the mid-20th century witnessed a remarkable abandonment of this concern to govern musical practices. It's sad that as a society we have tacitly assumed that it's a good idea to turn over the shaping of musical affections in the young to commercial interests who will eagerly exploit various youthful anxieties in order to maximize their profits. Kids who early on learn to embrace the modern ideal of autonomy, promoted through advertising and various civic forces, want to define themselves over against their parents, and so defiantly want music of their own, especially music that expresses their desire for being let loose, especially music that their parents don't like. I've heard this explicitly said in the promotion music. You listen to this, your parents will hate it. Kids whose identity is no longer secure in their family, neighborhood, or church want to be cool, and so often anxiously want music that will align them with the right group. Kids who are experiencing new emotional and physical urges are rarely trained in the theory and practices of self-control, and so passionately want music that will give them the rush of immediate release through simple and often addictive sensory experiences. These are all dubious desires, but they're typically encouraged in modern culture and commonly sustained by popular culture. Tradition, discipline, and refinement are not high on the list of cultural values in modern America. Historically, the unique capacity of music to release the passions, to disconnect desire from reason, was well recognized, and so musical experiences of the young were carefully bounded. Today, we celebrate the superior authenticity of untrained passions. Authenticity means we're most fully human when we're most like animals, which is odd. We're really authentic if our desires haven't been trained in any way. Skepticism about objective meaning in the cosmos heightens the value of instinctive desires, and so our notions of freedom and self-expression leave no room for the virtue of self-control, let alone for the cultivation of superior taste. As a result, the experience of music for most Americans has, at least for 50 years, been shaped decisively by a set of non-musical cultural ideas, which bring together many of the most troubling aspects of modernity. Now, it's typically assumed that if music has any meaning, it can only be present in the lyrics. And I'm glad that we had this experience of perceiving meaning in form, in these visual forms. But I think it's still harder for people to perceive meaning in musical forms, in oral forms, than it is in visual forms. The idea that artistic expression, in any artistic expression, that form is content, that the medium is the message, has typically been overlooked or denied with regard to music. So it's typically assumed that music is meaningless, but the ideal, if you will, of meaningless music is as false as the ideal of meaningless sex. It's just not true. Megachurch pastor and best-selling author Rick Warren, who's been a guide for many Protestant clergy, declares confidently in his book, The Purpose-Driven Church, music is nothing more than an arrangement of notes and rhythms. It's the words that make a song spiritual. Now, when I read that several years ago, I was reminded of the exchange in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. You remember when Eustace, the bratty Eustace, meets Ramandu, a being who had claimed to be a star in human form. And Eustace says, in our world, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. To which Ramandu, really speaking for C.S. Lewis here, says, even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of. Music is made of notes and rhythms and a few other things, but that's not what music is. The assumption that music is just notes and rhythms reminds me of a quip made by the often sardonic English conductor Thomas Beecham, who died in the early 60s. He once said, the English may not like music, but they absolutely love the noise it makes. Now, to enjoy the noise that music makes while denying or ignoring its meaning might be called concupiscence of the ears. Joseph Pieper wrote a short essay on concupiscence of the eyes, in which he anticipated decades ago how our living in a world of ubiquitous glowing screens makes our age the most susceptible of all epochs to this particular form of worldliness. Long before there were smartphones or touchscreen tablets, Pieper observed, there is a gratification in seeing that reverses the original meaning of vision and works disorder in man himself. The true meaning of seeing is perception of reality, but concupiscence of the eyes does not aim to perceive reality, but to enjoy seeing. And I would argue that that posture is very similar to how most people engage with music. They're not really interested in perceiving its meaning. They may even explicitly deny that there could be any meaning there. So there's a desire to hear without understanding. It may be motivated by a kind of a Gnostic assumption that people may have, that the life of the body, the work of the senses, is an inert and mute realm that only applies meaning when we arbitrarily insert it or assert about it. But to treat the material world as devoid of meaning is to deprive it of its goodness, as an image of something more than matter. It's to separate it from God and thereby promote its rivalry of God. But if, in fact, the material world is not devoid of meaning, if all of creation is in some sense an epiphany, then our imaginations must be trained to perceive the meaning that awaits and welcomes us. The forming of a Christian imagination involves the training of the believer's intuitions to see the world or hear the world for what it really is, a meaningful sacramental image of transcendent realities. And rightly ordered imaginations can enable us to seek to resonate sympathetically with the order of creation. Lewis captures this near the beginning of The Abolition of Man when he explains that in classical thought, including in patristic theology, it was assumed that, in Lewis's phrase, the little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. The belief that feelings need to be trained may be the most alien aspect of the pre-modern understanding of human experience for modern men and women to accept. Thanks to Freud, we've learned to suspect anything that resembles repression. Public culture incessantly celebrates what Philip Rieff described as a character ideal that is in principle anti-ascetic. So we're not interested in the training of desires, but the understanding of music was probably since Pythagoras understood to be tied to desire. So the absenting of teachers and parents and clergy from the training of the perception, from the training of desires that is possible through music has just been lost. Now, we all know in this room that assumptions about freedom and desire, about lower and higher aspects of the inner life, about restraint and uninhibited expression aren't arbitrary quirks in modern culture, but they're essential aspects of the meaning of the modern and thoroughly woven in the institutions and practices of modern society. If that's the case, why wouldn't we assume it's present in music? This is a question I often ask rhetorically among people who are very alert to these huge tidal waves or currents in modern culture. Why is it assumed that somehow music has been exempt from those sorts of effects? And if it hasn't been, if it's at least hypothetically possible that our experience of music has been affected by the same things, then why aren't we working to try to figure those effects out? In an essay called Sing Artistically for God, Biblical Directives for Church Music, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger urged Christians to soberly assess the consequences of the separation of faith from culture. The interconnection of faith to culture, he wrote, is in the throes of a crisis. Since the end of the Enlightenment, faith and contemporary culture have drifted apart more and more. Up to that time, culture had developed from the roots of religion in Christian Europe, as in all history, and had remained tied to this matrix even in its secular forms of expression. The Renaissance and the Reformation marked a first crisis for this blending of church and culture. That shouldn't be blending. I must have misprinted there because he's really talking about separation. But not until the Enlightenment does a real cultural revolution, a decisive emancipation of culture from faith occur. The two go their separate ways. All in all, the gap has become wider and wider, and in the confusing conflict between the cultural experiments and the culture-less pragmatic activities of the church, I want to underscore both of those, the cultural experiments and the cultureless pragmatic activities of the church, it's obvious that we're at a loss as to how faith can and should express itself culturally in the present age. Faith has to take cultural form. And if we surrender the formation of culture to the faithless, we shouldn't be surprised that we see a faithless culture. If we celebrate a cultureless faith, we shouldn't be surprised to see a faithless culture. A Christian imagination is marked by the confidence that creation is meaningful in a way that properly evokes a subjective response. In modern thought, the universe is meaningless matter. There's no objective meaning in the nature of things. But this, of course, is not what the church believed or even the classical world believed. And so it was believed that it was appropriate for teachers to train the young to feel the right thing about, to have the right responses. But it does take time, and it takes a lot of attention. For students to submit to the discipleship of their imagination is to accept the propriety of their teachers to guide and correct their feelings as well as their thinking. And if there's a single lesson to be learned from the pre-modern church concerning music, it would be the importance of allowing our musical taste to be formed by the church's historic understanding of the nature and purpose of music, not by modernity's abuse and misuse of this wonderful gift. I want to mention here as a footnote, there's a book by Calvin Stapert that it's called A New Song for an Old World, which is a wonderful survey of the history of particularly patristic writings about music. And he points out early in the book that our understanding of music has been typically shaped. In fact, let me read this. Christians today live in a society whose musical thought is based on post-Enlightenment presuppositions, and the music we typically identify with as ours, whether we have classical or popular inclinations, is overwhelmingly post-Enlightenment. Our musical thought and practice have largely bought into the ideas and practices that came out of the Enlightenment and Romanticism. And this is true with classical music as well as popular music. Now, of course, the tradition, I want to quickly summarize, and I realize I'm running a little late here. Gregory of Nyssa, this is a quote from, actually, this is David Bentley Hart from The Beauty of the Infinite. He's summarizing Gregory of Nyssa's idea that creation is a wonderfully wrought hymn to the power of the Almighty. The order of the universe is a kind of musical harmony, richly and multifariously toned, guided by an inward rhythm and accord, pervaded by an essential symphony. The melody and cadence of the cosmic elements in their intermingling sing of God's glory, as does the interrelation of motion and rest within created things. And in this sympathy of all things one with the other, music in its truest and most perfect form is bodied forth. Clement of Alexandria similarly urged believers to seek out musical experiences which echoed the melodious order and harmonious arrangement of the universe. Like other theologians of the early church, Clement believed in a fundamental relationship between the oral harmony of music and the harmonious arrangement of all of creation as ordered by the Logos. Good music wasn't just pleasant sound, but a sacramental participation in a transcendent reality. Clement wrote that Christ, quote, composed the universe into melodious order and tuned the discord of the elements to harmonious arrangement so that the whole world might become harmony. And in his book, A New Song for the Old World, Calvin Stapert summarizes the goals of musical experience as understood by all of the church fathers. He writes that Clement particularly, quote, affirms music that he describes as sober, pure, decorous, modest, temperate, grave, and soothing, over against music he describes as licentious, voluptuous, frenzied, frantic, inebriating, titillating, scurrilous, turbulent, immodest, and meretricious. I've done this sometimes. I've asked young people, why do you like this music? What's your favorite music, and what qualities does it have that you like? I often hear is it's edgy, and Clement did not condemn edginess for some reason. I want to share some insights from Roger Scruton, who's written quite a bit about aesthetics of music. In his book called The Aesthetics of Music, he spells out in detail. Actually, let me read first quickly from his book, Culture Counts. He talks about musical education more generally. He says music education is of pressing importance in ensuring the survival of culture. By playing together, singing in groups or choirs, improvising, acquiring a repertoire of melodies, young people prepare themselves precisely for the thing that pop music withholds from them, the rite of passage out of adolescence. They acquire the intimate knowledge of a social togetherness in which discipline and order prevail. And they learn to discriminate between the true movement of music, which arises from its inner life, and the fake movement of the beat, which sounds from a place beyond the melody and beyond the realm of musical thought. And then later in the aesthetics of music, he spells out in detail how the three principal elements, typically music, melody, harmony, and rhythm, have analogs in social life in particular, but I would argue beyond social life, I would say there's an analog in spiritual life as well. He writes, a musical culture introduces its participants to three important experiences in three forms of knowledge. The first is the experience of melody, of musical thinking, as it begins in tonal space and leads onwards to an apt conclusion. In singing a melody, we understand the relation between phrases, the way in which tone calls to tone across the imagined space of music. Melodies have character, and in singing them, we imitate the forms of human life. Musical education teaches us to be alert to this character and to understand that the rightness or wrongness of a tone is the rightness or wrongness of a gesture. In singing, we rehearse our social nature just as we do in dancing, and it matters that we should sing in courteous and cheerful ways. Elsewhere, Scruton has said that in social dancing today, people no longer dance with each other, they dance at each other. The second experience is that of harmony, of voices sounding together, moving in concord, creating tensions and resolutions, filling the tonal space with an image of community. Classical harmony provides us with an archetype of human sympathy. The ability to notice a bass line, to feel the rightness of the notes and of the harmonies that erupt from them, is the ability to respond to a wider world, to value the other voice, and to situate both self and other in a moralized universe. And then the third experience is that of rhythm, by which I mean something other than the all-pervasive beat. I mean the pulse of human life displayed in measure, syncopation, and accent. Rhythm is a play of heartbeats which reaches to all mankind. You hear it in jazz, in the great works of classical music, a delicate display of accents which invites us to dance. Beat is not rhythm, but the last sad skeleton of rhythm. Stripped bare, it's interesting that we have drum machines. There's a reason for that. Nobody who understands the experiences of melody, harmony, and rhythm will doubt their value. Not only are they the distillation of centuries of social life, they're also forms of knowledge, providing the competence to reach out of ourselves through music, through melody, harmony, and rhythm. We enter a world where others exist besides the self. This is why music is a character-forming force. The decline of musical taste is a decline in morals. And then finally, to withhold all judgment, as though a taste in music were on a par with a taste in ice cream, is precisely not to understand the power of music. And then I will close by just pointing out that for hundreds of years, theologians, philosophers have been convinced for good reason that music was an appointed means of perception of divine order. Angels somehow apparently sing. And so will we for eternity. I'd like to say the only two cultural things we know we'll do forever is share a meal and sing. We may paint and sculpt and write sonnets, maybe even limericks, but we will certainly sing, even as we do now with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven. Thank you very much.